The framing of the U.S. Constitution and the distribution of power. The separation of powers and checks and balances. When the Founding Fathers got together, they decided on the goals of the Constitution as being these four which we had spoken about before. What was the best way to come together and resolve these problems that they've been having? Remember, they were worried about problems regarding trade and duty among the 13 states. They wanted to protect overseas interests. They wanted to cement their financial, property, and commercial interests. And they wanted to defend against the tyranny of the masses. So they decided that the best way to do this would be to create a central government. Central government would be able to handle all of these different things together and have the power to do so. All governments must have the power to do three things. To legislate, that means to make the laws. To administer, that means to execute laws. And to adjudicate, that means to interpret the laws. And so the Founding Fathers had to decide how they want to give this government power to do these things. So they came across a big decision that they had to make. Now that they decided they wanted to have a central government, how are they going to allocate these three powers without creating some sort of tyrannical institution? Remember, they just got out of a bad breakup with Britain. They're not wanting a monarchy. They're not wanting something which is going to have one strong power like a king or a queen. So they needed to come up with an idea that would allow them to distribute these powers, have the government have the power that it needed in order to carry on its work, while at the same time not giving rise to something which could create a problem for them. The compromise they came up with was that instead of one power wielder, they would divide the power amongst three separate institutions, and these three power wielders would then check on each other to make sure that none of them got too strong. And so we get the doctrine of the separation of powers. All this is a constitutional doctrine of dividing the governmental power between the three branches of government, among the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. All separation of powers really is the doctrine that we divide up power among these three branches. And so we got our three branches of the U.S. government: our legislative branch, our executive branch, and our judicial branch. The executive branch was allocated the power to administrate. In other words, they could enforce the laws. The legislative branch was allocated the power to legislate, meaning they could make the laws. And the judicial branch was allocated the power to adjudicate. That means interpret the laws. And all of these were written into the Constitution. And so we gave names to the institutions which would do these different jobs. We called this administrative branch, which would be the executive branch of government, the presidency and its accompanying bureaucracy. We decided that at this central government level, the legislative branch we would call Congress, and at the judicial branch we would refer to these as the courts, who would be the adjudicators and interpret our laws. And so we had our new structure of government. And you'll remember that when political process gives power to this government, and that governmental power is exercised in institutions. And so the government now has three institutions in it which are going to be executing that power and exercising the power which is given to them by the political process. The executive branch to enforce, the legislative branch to make the law, and the judicial branch to interpret. So let's talk a little bit about checking and balancing power. The first step was to create the separation of powers, and we did that. Now that we had three separate branches, we had to figure out how we were going to share the power among the branches. There was the problem that they worried that one branch might seek to get too strong and try to take the powers of another. If they worried that if you had three separate entities that were competing for power, they would constantly try to outdo each other, and that would create a problem of eventually having one branch which would rise up and beat down the other two. So how do we fix this problem? The Founding Fathers came up with the idea called checks and balances. And this is the constitutional doctrine in which each of these three branches gets some power, and part of their power is to limit the powers of the other branches. Let's take a look at some examples of these. So we have our three branches of government, and we have them in this circle here. At the top we have the executive, then we have the legislative on the bottom left, and the judicial branch on the bottom right. And we're going to take a look at how each of these branches utilizes its power to keep the others in check. First off, the legislature would make a law. So that would be a power which is allocated to the legislative branch of government. They have the power to write the laws and make the laws for the central government. However, this power is checked in a couple of ways. First, by the executive branch. The executive branch can veto the law. If the legislature comes up with a law that it likes and then gives it to the president has the option to veto it, and the law would not be able to be put in place. Another check would be that the judicial branch gets to interpret the law, so they get to say what the legislative branch actually meant, and this could dramatically change what the actual meaning of the law is or the way that it's implemented. A second example would be the executive branch issuing an executive order through the president. The president has decided that troops are to be sent to the ground of a particular country, and that is what is going to be carried out by the executive branch. Well, the legislative branch can check this power. The way that it can do this is by refusing to fund the executive order. The power of the purse belongs to Congress. That means that all money that is going to be spent has to be cleared through Congress. The presidency has no money of its own in order to fund the executive order and send troops to the ground. And so Congress actually has to give the money for it. So the Congress has a check on the presidency, the president's power to issue an executive order, by refusing to fund it. Lastly, let's look at the power of the judicial branch. The judicial branch can declare laws unconstitutional by reviewing the laws through judicial review. The executive branch, however, has a power which checks the judicial branch in that the executive branch is the branch which appoints judges to the central government's judiciary. And so the president has the power to nominate and appoint judges who will then sit on the bench. Additionally, the legislative power actually has a check on the president's power to appoint the judges. The president can appoint the judges, however, they must be confirmed by the Senate. If the Senate does not want to confirm the judges, they can strike down that nominee and the president would have to start all over again. So this is an example of the executive branch checking the judicial branch, and then the legislative branch checking the executive branch at the same time. And you'll see many more examples of this as you go through your book and as we do further studies. The important thing to remember here is the type of system which was put in place, and this idea that we wanted to make sure that there was a sharing of the powers. And this was a compromise which came out of the Constitutional Convention to make sure that when we came up with a constitutional way to allocate power, we would not have the same tyranny of the monarchy that we had in the previous government. And so this was, along with the separation of powers, a compromise which came out of the decisions of how we were going to allocate power in government and set up a governmental structure which could check itself so that we didn't run into a tyrannical problem.